Good.
So thank you so much for everybody, and apologies for the delays. We seem to be on point now using laptops and screens and everything, but we are here. Okay. Thank you so much for coming through for this special seminar, which is hosted by the Transformation Committee in the School of Public Health and the Human Biology Department as well. So we're honored to have Professor Goran Strkalj. He's a professor of anatomy and biological anthropology in the School of Biomedical Sciences at the University of New South Wales, Sydney, and he's visiting us at the university for this week. And prior to his arrival at UNSW, he worked at Wits Macquarie University in Flinders, where he was the discipline lead in anatomy, histology, and pathology. His main interests are in human biological variation, so the topic of very related to the topic of today, anatomical sciences education, and the history of anatomy and anthropology. So he has published over 100 papers and 5 books, including a monograph on humanistic anatomy, a new paradigm of an old discipline, and has edited a volume, Commemorations and Memorials, exploring the face of anatomy. So very warm welcome, Goran, and thank you for coming through to us as he will touch on race and bioethics in health sciences.
Thank you very much, Meleng. It's a great pleasure and great privilege to be here at UCT, university I last visited almost 20 years ago as Alan Morris's guest. So my presentation today is, and I know that the original answer was a bit of a mouthful and almost a page long, so I cut it short and then focus on the main issue of my presentation, which is the history of South African science, and focuses on one really unique event in the history of South African science, where a stage play called Anatomist, which focuses on anatomy and anatomical history, was produced by anatomists at Wits in the anatomical dissection hall. Now, it's one event, but in fact, when you look at that event and what preceded the event and what happened after the event, you have an intersection, I think, very nice intersection of many issues. Issues related to science, anatomy, medicine, issues related to inclusiveness, body donation, bioethics, body politic, if you like, and it all sort of intersects into that one event that happened almost 100 years ago. So, because we're late, without any further ado, I'll quickly go through the presentation outline. So I'll first, very briefly, talk about the importance of history of science, the importance of history to present-day practices in science, if any. And then, before I go to the main focus of my presentation, I sort of have to, and I know that there are people here who are not anatomists, I have to give a little bit of prehistory of what happened before and what inspired this staged play. So in the prehistory, I'll look at the actual events that inspired that play, The Anatomist. And then I'll also have to look at the history of anatomy in general. And then I'll talk about this production of The Anatomist, and then what happened afterwards and what's happening now. And as I go through these different phases of history of anatomy, I'm going to jump back and forth in different eras of anatomist troubled history. So, why is history important? Does history matter? I'll only touch about that subject because it's a huge subject discussed by historians, discussed by scientists. Does history of science matter to science? And you have people who will say, no, not at all. And people who will say history is exceptionally important. But even these people will differ. Why is it history important or why history isn't important. And I'll just focus on this, why I think history is important. And it's, I think, exceptionally important in sciences like ours, sciences that focus on humans that are alive and human tissue. And history, I think, is important because it offers a perfect medium for what reflection, what happened before, how does it relate to us, and reflexivity. How do we do things nowadays? How do they differ, if at all, from the people past? I'm going to quote here Jonathan Marks, biological anthropologist who influenced me a lot in early parts of my career. But what he says here about anthropologists and anthropologists being immersed in their intellectual history, I think should be applied for all scientists who study humans. So, going back to anatomy. So, start from the beginning. Anatomy is obviously this discipline that studies the structure of human body and their relations. And we know that the word anatomy comes from, the etymology is interesting, it comes from two Greek words, ana and temne, which means to cut apart. And that's simply because the main method of studying obviously structure of the human body would be to take human body, preferably dead human body, and then cut it apart and study these parts that human body is made of. I should stress that this has been the main approach to study and education in anatomy since the establishment of anatomy as a modern science, so say still from late Middle Ages up until now. In antiquity, dissections of human bodies were exceptionally rare. They were only present for a very brief period of time in Hellenistic Alexandria and possibly in India. But mainly these early anatomists studied human anatomy by proxy. So they would dissect animals and study maybe human bones and surface anatomy. So from the anatomy of the animals, they would make inferences of this is how the human anatomy looks like. They take obviously animals that are closer, have closer resemblance to humans, monkeys, pigs, and basically whatever they could get hold of. So, dissecting human body is not like dissecting anything else, or not like handling anything else, because human body is something different. Human body is ex person, or something that's still person and has personality. So when I talk about history of anatomy to my students, I like to start with this, I think, fantastic, beautiful quote from one of the historians, Roy Porter, historians of science, who talked about these numerous meanings of human body, which we as anatomists encounter as we encounter bodies that we dissect. And it's always underpinned by cultural attitudes and values of the flesh, anatomy and medicine. So, dissections were then introduced or revived, as I mentioned before, in the early universities in Europe, sort of 13th, 14th century, and we're not certain where the first public dissections were carried out for anatomical education. It is assumed from the existing resources that it happened at the beginning of the 14th century, with the first dissection being carried out by Italian professor of anatomy Modino de Luzzi. But in those days, dissections were not part of exploration of human bodies. They were mainly used for teaching purposes, because it was believed that everything that has to be known about human anatomy was already written in ancient times by great physicians and philosophers like Aristotle and Galen. So there's nothing new to be discovered. This is strictly for teaching purposes. And dissections were quite awkward in those days because you had 3 people involved in dissections, and the students would stand around and look at the demonstration. So obviously, the highest in the hierarchy of the 3 dissectors was the professor. So the professor would sit at the pedestal and read from one of the ancient books. The lowest of the 3, the dissector, would dissect. That would be one surgeon. And then somewhere in between was a stencer, the person would point at dissected structures with the pointer, with the stick. Now, this started to change with the new generations of anatomists because they noted, obviously, that ancient texts get the things wrong because they're mainly based on the anatomy of animals. So they would talk, for example, of the liver with 5 lobes and so on. And they realized that anatomy has to be rewritten. And the leading person in that process was obviously Andreas Vesalius, who is now considered to be the father figure of modern empirically oriented anatomy, and not just anatomy, but modern empirically oriented medicine and perhaps science. So Vesalius, unlike his contemporaries, dissected by himself. So it was hands-on approach, and he encouraged his students to dissect with him and to learn about anatomy and discover about the structures of the human body. And obviously, he produced the famous work, the Humani Corporis Fabrica, of the human body, which was like the encyclopedia, Gray's anatomy of.
Yes, I'm there. I'm listening now.
Okay, but there's a question now: where do the bodies come from? And obviously, in those early days, the bodies were the bodies of the executed criminals. But as we had this paradigm shift with the Vesalius, we all need to dissect to learn about anatomy. There was immediately problem with the paucity of bodies for dissection. So what did Vesalius advise his students and contemporaries how to get more bodies to dissect? This is a dark part of this Vesalius that you don't hear about. You always, when they talk about Vesalius, it's how grand he was with his discoveries, and he was a genius. But the dark side is pushed aside. Here's another part from his book, right, where he advises students how to get hold of human tissue. So he advised them to go to graveyards, steal the bones, and if possible, steal the bodies from mortuaries. And here, he actually reports one of the case, not to condemn his students, but to say how clever his students are. So he stole the body of a young woman who died, and she was a mistress of a monk who was dangerous. And to avoid being caught and the body being identified, they skinned it off.
Oh.
Skin off, and then if they're apprehended, who knows who the person is. And that time, because of these passages from Fabrica, some historians claim that the Venetian Republic, Vesalius was based in Padua, in University of Padua, actually made the laws more stringent about sections and about human bodies. Anyhow, things become even worse later on, and then we enter in 18th and 19th century even more troubled times. And that's because of societal changes. So 18th, 19th century, in the era of industrialization in Western Europe, colonization, population growth, many wars in Europe, in colonies. So there was a need for more medical practitioners, particularly surgeons. So you need more surgeons, you need more medical schools, you need more anatomists, you need more bodies. So there was a real problem now with paucity of bodies for dissection. So how was that resolved? Well, know that by stealing bodies from the graveyards, mainly of poor people because they couldn't pay someone to guard graves. And not only that, so not only anatomists and their students, but there was all sorts of body snatching industry with people from the margins of the society to survive. Criminals saw a chance to earn sort of easy living. And we know quite a bit about these procedures because, among other things, diaries of grave robbers were preserved with the price list for the bodies. So we know that if the body was younger, was a younger person, if it was well preserved, and make a mental note of that, being well preserved, so not decomposed, you get a better price. And we know that children were sold by inch. So, and now you think things surely cannot get worse than that. Well, they can, because there are entrepreneurial persons who realized you can get bodies, fresh bodies, not decomposed, in a different way. How do you do that? Where you go and murder people. So here's the famous case of Burke and Hare, William Burke and his friend William Hare, who, it's a long story, I'll try to shorten it. William Burke and his wife had a flat in Edinburgh, one of the famous medical schools. And in fact, one of their tenants, they had tenants in one of their rooms, died. So they didn't know what to do with the body. And then one of the friends told them, but that's a good opportunity because you can sell it to the anatomist. And indeed they did that. And they were surprised how much money they got from the body. And there was an opportunity. So Burke then got in touch with his younger friend here, and they started luring people into their flat, mainly vulnerable people, mainly women, elderly, people with illnesses. They would take them to their apartment, and drunk, and whiskey, and then they would murder them. So usually they worked out the system, so the younger here would sit on the person's chest and Burke would strangle the person. So then we have a person who is quite fresh, so to speak, and I really apologize for my language. And they would take it to the anatomist and get a substantial amount of money. It took a while to apprehend them. Police had some suspicions about their activities, but they couldn't prove anything. So at the end of that whole affair, they actually murdered 16 people. And again, police couldn't prove it, so they took younger here and offered him immunity if he becomes witness for prosecution, which he immediately did, and then revealed everything that happened. And Burke was convicted to death by hanging, and his body was to be anatomized. So that's your irony. Anatomized meaning being sent to anatomy school for dissection. So it was sent there, it was dissected, his skeleton was preserved, and it's still at University of Edinburgh Museum, together with some of the memorabilia, some of the souvenirs that was made from his skin, purses and so on. So that was more or less the end of the affair, but the things that happened before. So one of the more important questions was, who did they sell their bodies to? They sell the bodies to the anatomist, Robert Knox. And I say the anatomist because he was probably at that time the most prominent anatomist in Edinburgh. He was educated at the University of Edinburgh. He became, again, there was huge demand for surgeons. He became a graduated military surgeon. He was involved in a battle at Waterloo, and there's one connection with South Africa, that he was posted to South Africa, where he developed interest in science, in zoology, and what then they called etymology. So he wrote his first papers about South African flora and fauna and indigenous races of South Africa, and published them in Edinburgh. But then he had an odd personality, and he entered into conflict with people easily, and he entered into conflict with one of his superiors, and he was discharged dishonorably from the army, returned back to Edinburgh. So what do you do after being discharged dishonorably from the army? You go to science. So he became Museum of Comparative Anatomy, Royal College of Surgeons in Edinburgh, and he became an anatomy lecturer. But anatomy lecturer extramural. So he was not affiliated to the university as a lecturer. He had a private school, and that was a custom in those days because university couldn't cope with the number of students, and there were numerous private schools of anatomy. And he very soon proved to be the most efficient and most loved anatomy teacher in Edinburgh, and he had huge numbers. He couldn't cope with the number of students who attended his lectures in dissections, and when he had so many students, he need lots of bodies. And he again ended up buying them from Bridie here. So what happened with him after the trial? He was trialed, obviously, but acquitted. And his defense was he didn't know. Now I think this is a really, really important issue, because is this a good defense? And as a scientist, we assume we don't need to know. Is this our duty? do we need to know? And I draw a parallel here with Anatomist in Nazi Germany. Right, so we know now there's evidence that they dissected unclaimed bodies that came from concentration camps. And they were tried after the Second World War. Their defense was, we didn't do anything wrong, just follow the law. And the law was, take the unclaimed bodies, don't ask where they come from. So the question is this enough? Or what do you do where the laws themselves are corrupt? And do we as a scientist have a duty to reflect and to question everything? I think we do. So anyhow, there was a huge outcry, public outcry after this affair, and Knox's career went down from that on. Although he was acquitted by court, again, there was a huge public outcry. And he was seen, and here's one of the many cartoons published in those days. In this cartoon, he was presented as a devil who cuts people's heads. And he tried to revive his career, but that was not successful because the numbers of students dwindled and were almost non-existent. He tried going to London and reviving his career in anatomy and pathology there, didn't work. So he changed his career completely, went to journalism, public writing, public speaking, and etymology, curiously enough. And he wrote one of the most famous books of the races of men genre in the 19th century, with typical racial typology, racial hierarchies, and so on that you find many of in those days. Okay, so that's Knox. What happened in the aftermath of this horrible affair? Well, immediately afterwards, nothing happened. Things continued as they were. But then similar cases appeared in other places, including London, and then government realized something has to happen, and we need to change this. So what they do, they introduced in 1832 in Britain, in some countries, in fact in many countries before that, so-called Anatomy Act, which allowed unclaimed bodies to be automatically sent to anatomists for dissection. Unclaimed bodies, meaning bodies of people who died in hospitals. In those days, many poor people went to hospitals. Rich people were treated at home. People from workhouses, people from what they called lunatic asylums, they died, they're not claimed by the family, they were automatically sent them to anatomists for dissection. So that basically solved the problem of lack of bodies. How ethical that is. To send someone's body without any consent, without any questions asked, directly for dissection. And we know from historical records that in fact medical men, and it was all medical men in those days, were treating people. So someone dies in the hospital, they know that the relatives live far away, they would wait for a few days and then send the notice to the family. By the time family comes to the hospital, they were late. One was already in the anatomist's hands. So that left a really dark legacy in anatomy. And we still feel that dark legacy today. And it's not just how bodies were sourced for anatomy, but how are they treated in the anatomy labs. Here's a bit of a joke from anatomy from one of the American universities. And these are real bodies that were dissected. These are someone's relatives, mothers, fathers, brothers, that students dissected. But that was allowed because it was sort of enabling students to get distance from the horrible acts of dissection and prepare them for medical practice. How that prepared students for medical practice, you don't want to think about. And the whole work and hair affair resonated quite a bit in the society. And there was all sorts of reactions in public, in art and popular culture. And that continues up until the present day. So plays, poems, comedies about it. I suppose it all helped process what happened and somehow deal with it. Sometimes it was a real reflection of what was happening. Sometimes it was just more curiosity about these events. And this interest continued way into the 20th century. So you have here big Hollywood movies based on events, mostly based on events. You have memorabilia produced up until the present day. You have an ashtray, look at the ashtray in the corner. And just a few years back, forensic anthropologists tried to reconstruct Burke's face from his skeleton. Again, is this real scientific interest or just more curiosity about things that happen? But again, as I said, some of these artworks provided a bit of reflection of what happens and tried to deal with all these traumas that came out of the event. And probably the most famous is James Bridie's play, The Anatomist. So James Bridie was probably a perfect person to write such a play because he was a medical doctor and also playwright. And at some point in his career, he left medical practice and devoted himself completely to playwriting and screenwriting. And at some point in time, he even had a good collaboration with Alfred Hitchcock on his early British movies. But his most famous place is The Anatomist. And The Anatomist is his vision on the Burke and Hare affair, with obviously Knox as the main character of the play. So that play, which again offered some opportunity for reflection and interpretation of these events, was premiered in 1930 in Edinburgh and then very soon afterwards in London. And the London premiere included some of the most famous actors of the day. And then subsequently, it was quite success, and it was produced later on. Probably the most famous production was in 1948 with famous Alistair Sim as Dr. Knox, and it was quite successful again. So BBC decided to make a TV movie from that play. The TV movie is still available; it can be downloaded from different databases. And then the words about the play came to a small university in South Africa, University of Witwatersrand. So I'm just going to quickly go through Wits Anatomy Department history. I mean, Wits is here just around the corner, so we all know about Wits, my alma mater. So Anatomy Department was established in 1919, which is before the university got its charter 3 years later. So it was together with physiology, one of the first departments of the future medical school. It still didn't have a medical school. It was soon to be established. And the first head was Scottish anatomist Edward Stevie, but Stevie had to resign very quickly because he was a married man, he had an affair with the university secretary, and very conservative principal Ian Hofner forced him to resign. So I'm not saying this to give a bit of a gossip from 100 years ago, just to illustrate how small and how conservative Wits was in those days. But that's going to change, and that's going to change quite substantially, and Wits will become probably one of the most liberal universities, together with UCT in South Africa, and world famous for many research. And one of the people who will change this is Raymond Arthur Dart. So the second head of department who stayed the head of department for 25 years. And virtually changed this department from almost non-existent local provincial department into world-known center of excellence in many areas of research. Now, very quickly, we're South Africa, as you know about Dart. He was educated, Australian-born. He was educated at the University of Queensland and Sydney. As a medical student, he wanted to volunteer for the First World War. He wasn't allowed because he was studying medicine, and all the medical students had to finish medicine, then go to medical corps. By the time he graduated, the war was over. He was still sent to France, and then discharged earlier because there was a place for him at University College London as a senior demonstrator where he worked under famous Grafton Elliott Smith, another famous Australian anthropologist. But again, he had to leave in 1922. He had to leave. He was sort of pushed because he was a talented person, but he sort of liked to jump into conclusions of many issues, and he was started to be a bit of embarrassment at UCL. So he was pushed to accept the position of head of department at Wits. Head of department, so it looks like it was big promotion. It was in fact demotion because he was more or less head to himself in those days. But he managed to very quickly build this department out of nothing. And department virtually at the time didn't have cloth to cover bodies in the section hall. So he started from zero and then built up the department and the medical school to a large extent. He was a bit lucky in that sense because he got in possession in late 1924 of hominid fossil remains, famous town child, Mastopithecus africanus, which he interpreted, published as the first hominid, as they called it in those days, and hit the news all over the world. His interpretation was not accepted for 25 years, but still he made a splash in the news. And suddenly this small university became world famous for this discovery. And we know that Wits is still famous for paleoanthropological research and controversy in the paleoanthropological research from that day. Okay, so what's his legacy? He was a multifaceted scientist, and he was involved in so many things in anatomy, anatomy education, medical education, anthropology, archaeology, primatology, curiously enough, surgery, war medicine, and so on. That's mainly from the influence of Grafton and Elliot Smith, who had that idea of human biology as overreaching science. Based in anatomy, but then from anatomy you go into subdisciplines such as anthropology, neuroscience, even social anthropology, archaeology, history of science. So that's all these sciences about humans. And Dart basically copied that approach in Wits and developed research in many areas. And he's now known for his research in many, particularly paleoanthropology. But also there's the sort of Dart legacy, mainly his research on race and racial typology. Was he racist? That's I leave that to aside for the time being. From today's perspective, he was. He believed in racial hierarchy, but in those days, he was probably the most liberal anthropologist, not just in South Africa, but globally. But again, there's something to be further investigated. Okay, I now finally come to that Wits production of the Anatomist. So the idea for the production, in fact, came from one of the senior lecturer in the department, Alexander Galloway, but Dart immediately picked it up. And he saw it as a fantastic opportunity to do something. And it's clear from the archival documents, which are kept at Wits archives, that he was the real force behind it. So the idea was to stage this production in the section hall and to use the proceedings to support the new wing of Johannesburg General Hospital. So they quickly gathered support from the sponsors, various sponsors, including local brewery and so on, and support from people from other departments. So the producer of this play was Professor Stemmers, who was then head of Department of Physiology, and he was producer because he was in London previous year, and he actually saw The Anatomist in one of the theaters in London. Galloway was technical director, and cast were mainly students with some staff, and obviously the main role went to Raymond Dart. He was The Anatomist. So this was a big occasion in Johannesburg at that time. They in fact had to fit in 3 days 4 performances because there was lots of interest. Here's the original booklet, the program, Raymond Dart's program. So four performances in 3 days. One on the 15th, they had 2 performances in the afternoon and in the evening. Well attended, press was there, obviously, and reception was fantastic, really positive. So in the reviews, it was stressed that how perfect the environment was. Where else to stage Anatomist than in an anatomy section hall? But they also praised the performances and how everything was organized. And the accolades, main accolades, went to Dart. And he was the star of the evening. He recognized himself in Knox, and I'll talk about that shortly. And also they had letters from people from different institutions, from Wits Philosophy, from South African associations, Medical Association, Veterinary Association, and importantly from Wits Medical Student Society, who thought this is a great opportunity to express themselves, probably to reflect, to have sort of more philosophical understanding of what they're doing and so on. But what was the interpretation of the whole work and here affair in those days? Did they look at Knox as a devil, as he was looked at in days where everything happened? Not really. So the interpretation in those days completely reversed. And as Bates, in his wonderful biography of Knox, noted, in this play, Knox was morally rehabilitated. So he was seen as a victim. So he was someone who has to deal with community that doesn't understand him, doesn't understand science, full of prejudice, and he had to fight all this. And at the end became the victim. And what appeared to be his immoral acts were in fact attempt to do something better for the whole society. Now this might sound really strange, but if you look at the social context in these days, and several issues, so Bates, for example, notes that this is the era where eugenics was at its height. So it was sort of acceptable that some people, well, could be sacrificed for the betterment of other people, or maybe better deserving to survive and to spread their genes to the next generation. And I think Dart, I see Dart within that understanding of Knox. And that's, I think, why he managed to identify himself with Knox. Now, the idea was not about bodies and bodies for dissection. This, I think, Dart understood as something that's resolved. There's no problems now with getting bodies for dissections. They were unclaimed bodies, and there was lots of them for Dart to work with. Bear in mind, all these bodies at that time were bodies of indigenous people who were just thrown into anatomy department, unclaimed bodies, to the anatomy department. And there was one historian of science called it frightful symmetry. So you have disenfranchised people whose bodies, not donated, whose bodies are taken for medical education, and then who profits from that? Higher echelons, doctors and people who control the society. But I think where Dart sees himself as close to Knox is his attempt to get remains of indigenous people for his study. So the remains of people which will help him to, quote unquote, get the racial history of South Africa. So you need remains, you need bones. So how do you get to that? You go and pillage the graveyards. Right, so that's something that was even in those days, colonial days, were not seen as something that's allowable. Not because of any concerns about indigenous people, but because of religious sort of concerns that consecrating any grave is a sin. So they were basically not allowed to do that, but there was always a blind eye if there were graveyards of indigenous people. So there are several books that describe this horrible strategy of grave robbing people, indigenous people, for the betterment of science. So what's more important than understanding the racial history of right, and that was one of those. That was one of those who was engaged in this study. Okay, I have to hurry up because we're running out of time. Were there any changes to these? Yeah, but they came only later. Next generation of scientists, mainly with Dart's successor Philip Tobias, who was deeply influenced by Dart and his racial typologies. But really, very quickly, especially when he got in contact with people from outside South Africa, he clicked, and because the racial paradigm was already dismantled at the time, and he managed to distance himself from the legacy. And when it comes to sourcing bodies for anatomy dissection, he was the first to start off body donation program. And he even, again, looking at what universities in other parts of the world are doing, introduced dedication ceremony to people whose bodies are used for dissection. And that dedication ceremony continues up until the present day. Okay, I'm going to quickly jump to the present day. How do we source bodies and human tissue for anatomical education now? In 2012, International Federation of Association of Anatomists, so the biggest association of anatomists, international association, issues these recommendations of good practice for donation of human bodies and tissues for anatomical education. It's a longish document, but the key issue here is that the only ethically justifiable mode of acquiring bodies for anatomical examination is through body donation requests. Right? So nothing without consent. Is this practice nowadays, so we don't have to reflect and think about bad practices and so on? Certainly not. So if you see this map produced by colleagues from Germany, they actually did a worldwide survey of how bodies are sourced for anatomical examination in different parts of the world. So all in these countries in dark green, anatomy departments rely only exclusively on donations. Light green, mainly donations, but also some unclaimed bodies. Yellow, mainly unclaimed bodies, some donations. Orange, unclaimed bodies. Blue, you don't want to think about. Blue means bodies of executed criminals are still used. Gray, we don't know. But we do know that there are some countries in the Middle East that import bodies, usually for poorer countries, mainly India and the Philippines. So trade in human remains going on, no problems at all. So how are things in South Africa? South Africa is one of the great examples of how things are reversed. Right? And now most of the bodies in the section halls are donated. There are some unclaimed, mainly donated. And especially in big universities like UCT and in Wits, all bodies that use this sex are donated, so with consent. This is one of the older research that shows some demographic changes. So body donations lift off from the early days when Tobias introduced them, were really good in the 90s, then dropped in 2000s, and then they elevated. It sort of stops in 2013, but we know that afterwards it again, donations increased quite a bit. But when you look at demographics, right, in the previous time, so that frightful symmetry now reversed. So you mainly have donation from people of African origin. You have bodies sourced from people of African origin, but now donations mainly people of European origin that donate. Various reasons for that. Many people say cultural, partly cultural, I agree with that, but also I think it's something similar to what we see in the United States, where African Americans rarely donate bodies. And that's because of the mistrust of the system. It abused certain groups of people for a long period of time. Something to ponder as we move forward in years. And finally, I finish with this. Were there any other performances of the Anatomist? Was it something similar where people used art and play to reflect about anatomy's history. And in fact they are. And here's an example from Mayo Medical School, where they have a big, really complex project of students as resurrectionists. So they ask the students to get into that era and try to find themselves as resurrectionists. How do they think? What do they do? And express themselves in the art, various arts, because different students, different learning styles, and so on. And later on, that whole discourse ended up in performance of not of the Anatomist, but in a theater performance organized by students of the Body Snatchers by Stevenson, which were dramatized and prepared for that production. And the outcomes, in terms of students' reception, students' reflection, and changes in behavior, were fantastic. So, to conclude, anatomy in terms of ethics made huge strides in recent years, particularly end of 20th century and beginning of 20th century. Is everything good? No, it isn't. And what we can do to change things around, to constantly reflect, to include reflexivity in things that we do today, and continue changing things for the better. And I finish with this. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Prof. Goran. I think this is a very apt discussion, particularly with the Sutherland Reverian. And that's what we thought, combining both from a human biology point of view and a public health point of view, for us to actually understand what is all the fuss about. Because I've heard people saying, well, are we supposed to go join the Guard of Honor tomorrow? What does this have to do with public health? Because it really isn't. But I think the parallels towards how history has changed, and also what we do in public health is to study people and to study populations of people. We might not source them directly, but they are, parallels that we can learn from history about our own ethical ways of our own conduct, particularly different communities that we interact with, and how we go and extract knowledge, and how we do that in an ethical manner. So in the interest of time, I see we haven't had any questions online, but I've got 2 in the audience, which we'll take, and then hopefully we'll still manage for 1 o'clock. So you can start.
Thank you so much, that was lovely. I took a lot of pictures, the reason being that I've just introduced, so I teach first years, so it's all the first years we do a common course, becoming a professional in the second semester. So we introduce them to public health. So, I mean, we've had to consider what is happening in our context. There's a lot of suicide among students. And so we have been intentional about introducing the arts in public health, or rather reintroducing the arts in public health. And so I mean, I'm looking for content that would be relevant to students. And I'm thinking, what would happen if they were to reproduce that play, for instance, in this current climate? What would be the outcome of that? Considering the injustices of the past, the historical perspective. I was a vet before I came to UCT, and I mean, looking at Africanization of science and what it means to us. Because I mean, each time I went to the anatomy lab, I was horrified, and but then I had to reflect on the fact that they're trying to teach students. So I mean, I really appreciate this, and I had wondered if you would speak, to the claimed versus the donations, because the lived reality is that Black people do not trust the donation process, both as the living and also the dead. And we afford the greatest dignity to the dead. But now we potentially have a case, we may have a case of a doctor who has violated a corpse. And that then speaks to the ethics of care. So I mean, you mainly focused on ethics, but have not touched on the legal aspects. So I have wondered if in your writings and also in your deliberations, if one is looking into that, because both are interlinked when we're talking to conditions.
Take that. Second comment.
So I thought that use like the simulation labs and Anatomist work, right? So is the move now, how much in the world, like I'm surely like in the US, North America, where they have access to this technology, is that not like becoming more of the mainstream now? And then it'll, like in maybe 50 years, it'll be like a completely forgotten that you actually had a real one.
Yeah, and I get the question. So let me start with the first one. The legal framework is exceptionally important, and nothing happens with without a proper legal framework. And we know that in some countries, the legal framework is loose, sometimes non-existent. We know that in India, for example, it's pretty loose. People are not certain how to work around it. So that's the first sort of step. We have a proper legal framework, and then work with the proper legal framework. And even in South Africa, both body donation and unclaimed bodies are allowed legally. So in some countries, it's forbidden. You can only have bodies by body donation. But again, I give you exceptional bodies. And in countries where I originally come from Serbia, right, it's absolute mess, right, with the legal framework, because they had fairly good legal framework before the Second World War. Then the new government, there was a communist revolution. Right? So communists came to power and scrapped all the old laws, which was in some instances good thing, but didn't introduce new one on donation. So it was sort of in the limbo, what happened and how it was made. And only a few years ago they reworked that framework. So again, I agree with you that that's the first thing to start with. And what frightens me is that sometimes you have perfect legal system and you still have breaches. Right? So in the university that I come from, the University of New South Wales, 10 years before I came, they had a huge case where they did inappropriate things with body remains, right? When no one was looking. One of the things that was that body remains were not properly labeled, so they mixed body parts from different individuals. And then they had some unsupervised process with students with inappropriate things with body parts. Now the thing is, they did that because I suppose no one was observing, and the law is somewhere there. But if they have that, as you said, instruction at the beginning, tells them about the ethics and why it's important to behave in certain ways, then I think they can alleviate these possible breaches of ethical and even legal standards. So if I get that, then Jonathan said, you're absolutely right, but curious enough, in the United States, where they have all the resources, right, they still dissect. And the reason why they dissect is, one of the reasons is, many people still think that's the best way to learn anatomy, but not only that, they do it because of the ethical reasons. Because they think if you start as a medical student interacting with the dead body of your donor and treat it as your first patient, you start learning that medical ethics. And they use this not only for anatomy teaching, but for so-called non-traditional discipline-independent skills, medical ethics, developing empathy, and so on. So they think cadavers are exceptionally important. And that's, I think, what body is related. All around the world, I think anatomists have that perception. And the bodies are important not only because of the anatomy, but all these things that come with working with that body, with your tissue.
Thank you so much, Goran, for that. And thank you to everybody for staying through for the next 5 minutes. Please, tomorrow, get your gowns, be part of the commemoration that will be happening, and hopefully we all, again, take the lessons from this session into our own setting and into our teaching and our research as well. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. 2 o'clock, right?